Determine algebraically whether the functions in each pair are inverses of each other. So what you can do is you can take one of the equations. So in part I, if I take y equals 3x minus 6 and I find the inverse. How do I find the inverse algebraically? We switch x and y. So now I'll write x equals 3y minus 6, and then I will solve for y. So how do I solve for y? Add 6 to both sides, and then divide by 3. So my equation of the inverse is x plus 6 divided by 3. Does that match with the other equation? No. So no, they are not inverses. Now for the second one. The second one gives us a parabola, y equals negative x squared plus 3, and then only tells us to use a piece of it. Only tells us there's a restriction. This part right here is a restriction on the domain. So first of all, we're going to do the same thing. We've got our one equation, which is negative x squared plus 3. We're going to find the inverse. And when we find the inverse, it's going to be switch x and y. I'm going to move my y squared over to this side and my x to this side. Square root both sides. And my square root on both sides is going to tell me plus or minus. Now we have to decide which one we're going to use. Now if the restriction on the domain is that the x values have to be greater than 0, that restriction on the domain means on the inverse, well, if you switch x and y, instead of x being greater than or equal to 0, y has to be greater than or equal to 0. Because everything gets switched, x and y. So if your original domain was x bigger than or equal to 0, then your inverse, the y values, have to be bigger than or equal to 0. And if your y values are bigger than or equal to 0, which one are we going to choose? The plus square root or the minus square root? It has to be the plus square root. So we get positive square root x minus 3. Can you see that if you wrote the 3 first, that would be 3 minus x. And so these ones, yes, they are inverses of each other. What you could do is you could look at the graphs of each of these and compare them as well. We're not going to do that right now. But you could draw the graphs and see, have the x and the y values switched? Is it a reflection over the line y equals x? And then you could also see that the second one is an inverse and the first one isn't. Seven and 8, and I'm going to put 11 and 13 with a little star because those ones are going to make you think. Those are the next level. So on your exam, there's always a couple of questions that are designed on the exam to make you think a little bit. That might be a little bit different than your notes that you saw in class. Those kind of questions, that's why I gave you 11 and 13. You have the tools to figure them out. Everything that we've learned is the tools that'll help you figure them out. Now you'll have to problem solve and see if you can figure out how you can use the things you've learned in class to solve a new question in a new situation.